It was supposed to be funny. Just a harmless joke after everything I'd been through during those long 9 months. I thought it would shake things up, wake Mark out of whatever fog he'd been living in since I got pregnant. I wanted him to feel something for once. Anything, instead of just going through the motions, like my pregnancy was some kind of inconvenience he had to endure. I was lying in the hospital bed, exhausted from 12 hours of labor, holding my newborn daughter for the first time. She was perfect, tiny, and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair that reminded me of her father. My husband, Mark, was standing by the window, making phone calls to family members, telling everyone about the birth with this quiet pride in his voice that I hadn't heard in months. That's when I saw Tyler walk through the door of my hospital room, holding a bouquet of yellow flowers, and wearing that crooked smile that had gotten me into trouble more times than I could count. When I saw Tyler was my ex-boyfriend from 2 years ago, someone I'd been texting with on and off throughout my pregnancy when Mark was working late, or being his usual distant self. The look on Mark's face when he turned around and saw Tyler standing there was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Pure shock followed by the room was completely silent confusion, followed by something that looked like genuine pain. For a moment, nobody said anything. The room was completely silent, except for the baby making small sleeping sounds against my chest. I started laughing because the whole situation was so ridiculous and unexpected. Here we were in the sterile hospital room celebrating the birth of our daughter, and my ex-boyfriend was standing there with flowers, like he'd been invited to some kind of family event, which I guess he had been. Mark asked what Tyler was doing there, his voice quiet but tight with control. I explained that I'd invited him, but I thought it would be funny to have him stop by after the birth. Just for laughs, just to see everyone's reaction. I was still feeling punchy from the pain medication and the emotional rush of giving birth, and the whole thing seemed hilarious to me in that moment. But Mark didn't laugh. He didn't smile or shake his head or make any comment about my sense of humor. Instead, he walked over to where I was holding our daughter. Very gently took her from my arms and handed her to one of the nurses. Then he looked at me for a long moment, like he was trying to memorize my face, and walked out of the room without saying another word. Tyler stayed for maybe 5 minutes after Mark left, looking uncomfortable and making small talk about how beautiful the baby was. But it was clear that the joke had fallen flat. That nobody was finding this as amusing as I'd thought they would. The joke had fallen flat. He left the flowers on the bedside table and said he'd text me later, then disappeared as quickly as he'd arrived. I spent the rest of that day trying to call Mark, but every call went straight to voicemail. The nurses kept asking if my husband was coming back, if someone was picking us up when I was discharged. I made excuses, said he was probably just overwhelmed by becoming a father, that he'd be back soon with baby clothes and car seat. But Mark never came back that day, or the next day, or the day after that. That night, lying alone in the hospital bed with my daughter sleeping in the bassinet beside me, I got an email from Mark's personal account. The subject line was just one word: divorce. The message inside was I got an email from Mark, short and formal, saying that he'd be filing papers as soon as possible, and that I should find my own way home from the hospital. I stared at that email for probably an hour, reading it over and over, trying to understand how we'd gone from new parents to divorce proceedings in the span of 24 hours. It had been a joke, a stupid, harmless prank that was supposed to get a reaction, not destroy my marriage. The truth is, Tyler and I had been in contact throughout my pregnancy. Nothing physical, nothing that crossed any real lines, but we'd been texting and messaging when I was feeling lonely or ignored by Mark. Tyler was fun and flirty, and paid attention to me in ways that Mark hadn't for months. Mark had become so distant during the pregnancy, always working late at his accounting firm, always tired when he came home, always focused on practical things like budgets and baby gear instead of the emotional connection I needed. Sometimes I felt like he saw the pregnancy as a burden, rather than something to celebrate, like he was already resenting the changes a baby would bring to our comfortable life. When I was 7 months pregnant, Tyler had reached out on social media to congratulate me on the baby news. The attention felt good. We'd started messaging back and forth, just catching up on life and reminiscing about our relationship. He said he'd always wondered what would have happened if we'd stayed together, that he was happy for me, but also a little jealous of Mark. The attention felt good. Tyler remembered things about me that Mark seemed to have forgotten. He asked about my day, complimented photos I posted, made me feel like I was still interesting and attractive instead of just a pregnant woman waiting for her life to really begin. I never cheated on Mark, never did anything physical with Tyler, but I'd been emotionally investing in someone else during one of the most important times in my marriage. And maybe that was just as damaging. I wanted to shake things up. Maybe inviting Tyler to the hospital was the logical conclusion of months of inappropriate contact that I'd been telling myself was harmless. The idea to invite Tyler to the delivery room had come to me during labor when I was feeling emotional and dramatic and maybe a little vindictive about how detached Mark seemed from the whole experience. I wanted to shake things up to force some kind of reaction from my husband who'd been sleepwalking through my pregnancy. I texted Tyler while Mark was out getting coffee, told him to come by the hospital just for fun, that it would be hilarious to see Mark's face when he walked in. Tyler had seemed confused, but game for whatever I was planning. He said he'd stop by after work with flowers, that it would be good to see me. I'd expected Mark to be surprised, maybe a little jealous, possibly even grateful for the wake-up call about how much he'd been taking me for granted. I expected Mark to be surprised. I thought he might realize that other men still found me attractive, that he needed to step up his game if he wanted to keep me interested. What I didn't expect was the complete shutdown, the immediate withdrawal, the sense that something fundamental had broken between us that couldn't be repaired with explanations or apologies. The discharge from the hospital was a nightmare. I had to call my sister to pick up me and the baby because Mark wasn't answering his phone, and I had no other way to get home. My sister asked a lot of questions about where Mark was, why he wasn't there for his daughter's first trip home, what was going on between us. I tried to explain that we'd had a misunderstanding, that Mark was being dramatic about something that wasn't a big deal. But even as I said it, I could hear how weak the explanation sounded. Even my sister, who usually supported me no matter what, seemed confused and disapproving. When we got to the apartment, Mark's things were gone. Not all of them, but enough Mark's things were gone to make it clear that he'd moved out while I was still in the hospital. His clothes, his laptop, his coffee maker, the framed photos of us that used to sit on the kitchen counter. He'd left all the baby stuff, but taken everything that marked the space as his. I found a note on the kitchen table explaining that he'd be staying at his brother's place while we figured things out. He said he needed time to think about our marriage and whether it was something he wanted to continue. The note was formal and cold, like something you'd write to a roommate you barely knew. That first week home with the baby was the hardest week of my life. I was dealing with postpartum hormones, sleep deprivation, and the overwhelming responsibility of caring for a newborn, while also trying to process the fact that my marriage might be over. I kept expecting Mark he didn't call or text come home, to realize he was overreacting, to want to see his daughter, even if he was angry with me, but he didn't come home. He didn't call or text. When I tried to reach out to him, his responses were brief and focused solely on practical matters, like health insurance and bank accounts. He never asked about the baby, never wanted to know how she was sleeping or eating or whether she'd smiled yet. Within a week, I received formal legal documents informing me that Mark had filed for divorce and was seeking full custody of our daughter. The papers cited irreconcilable differences and included a detailed timeline of my contact with Tyler during the pregnancy, including screenshots of text messages that Mark must have found on my phone. Reading those messages in a legal document presented as evidence of my unfitness as a wife and mother made me see them differently than I had when I was sending them. The flirting that had seemed harmless looked calculating and deceptive, reading those messages in a legal document. The emotional intimacy I'd shared with Tyler looked like a betrayal of my marriage vows. Friends started reaching out after word spread about the divorce filing. Most of them were shocked and confused, asking what had happened, whether it was true that I'd invited my ex-boyfriend to the delivery room. When I tried to explain that it had been a joke, that Mark was overreacting, that the whole thing was being blown out of proportion, I could hear the doubt in their voices. My best friend Sarah was the most direct. She asked me point blank whether I'd been having an affair with Tyler, whether the baby was even Mark's, whether I'd lost my mind completely. Sarah was the most direct when I assured her that nothing physical had happened, that the baby was definitely Mark's, that I'd just made a stupid mistake. She said she needed some time to process everything. My own family was divided. My mother was horrified that I'd invited an ex-boyfriend to such an intimate family moment, but also angry at Mark for abandoning me with a newborn baby. My sister tried to be supportive, but I could tell she thought I'd brought the whole situation on myself. My father didn't say much, but his silence felt like judgment. Tyler, meanwhile, had completely disappeared from my life. His silence felt like judgment. After that awkward 5 minutes in the hospital room, he'd stopped responding to my texts and messages. When I tried calling him to explain what was happening, to ask him to talk to Mark, and clarify that nothing inappropriate had ever happened between us, his phone went straight to voicemail. I realized that Tyler had probably figured out pretty quickly that he'd been used as a prop in some kind of marital drama that he wanted no part of. He'd moved on with his life while I was left dealing with the consequences of involving him in mine. The custody battle was swift and brutal. Mark's lawyer painted me as an unstable woman who'd emotionally cheated on her husband throughout her pregnancy and then subjected him to psychological cruelty by flaunting her affair in a medical setting. Custody battle was swift and brutal. They had evidence of months of inappropriate contact with Tyler, witnesses who could testify about my behavior during the pregnancy, and the undeniable fact that I'd invited another man to one of the most intimate moments of my marriage. My lawyer tried to argue that I'd made a mistake in judgment, but that I was a loving mother who deserved time with her daughter, but it was hard to defend actions that looked so deliberately hurtful when laid out in chronological order in a legal document. The judge awarded Mark temporary full custody with supervised visitation for me once a week. I was devastated, but my temporary full custody with supervised visitation lawyer said it was actually better than he'd expected, given the circumstances. He said that if I could demonstrate stability and good judgment over the next few months, we might be able to negotiate for more time, but demonstrating stability was harder than I'd anticipated. I was living alone in an apartment that felt too big and too quiet, working a job that barely covered my expenses, dealing with postpartum depression, and the isolation of being cut off from my daughter for most of the week. The supervised visits were torture. I had to meet with my daughter in a sterile room at a family services center with a social worker taking notes about every interaction. I had to meet with my daughter. My daughter, who was only a few months old, didn't know me well enough to be comfortable in my arms. She'd fuss and cry during our visits, reaching for the social worker instead of settling against me. Mark would drop her off and pick her up without making eye contact with me. We never spoke directly, everything going through the social worker or our lawyers. I could see that he looked tired, but healthy, like he was managing single parenthood better than I was managing my new reality as a part-time mother. I tried posting about the situation on social media, hoping to get support from friends or to present my side of the story, but the response on social media were mostly negative. People seemed to think that inviting an ex-boyfriend to a delivery room crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, regardless of whether it had been intended as a joke. One of my former CO workers commented that she couldn't believe I'd done something so cruel to my husband during what should have been one of the happiest moments of his life. Another friend from college said she was praying for me, but also praying for Mark and the baby like they were the real victims in the situation. The isolation was crushing. I'd lost my husband, the isolation daily relationship with my daughter, and most of my social circle in the span of a few months. The friends, who'd still talk to me, treated me like I was fragile or unpredictable. Carefully avoiding topics that might upset me. Dating was impossible. Who wants to get involved with a woman who's in the middle of a custody battle? Who dating was impossible, only sees her baby once a week? Who has a reputation for making spectacularly poor decisions at crucial moments? The few men I met through dating apps seemed to think my situation was either too complicated or too revealing about my character. Work became my only escape from thinking about everything I'd lost. I threw myself into projects that kept me busy during the day and exhausted enough to sleep at night. But even there, I could feel colleagues treating me differently after word spread about my personal situation. My boss, who'd been understanding about maternity leave and the custody issues, started making comments about my focus and reliability. She never said anything directly, but I could tell she was wondering whether someone who'd made such poor personal choices could be trusted with important professional responsibilities. The apartment felt like a tomb. I'd kept all the baby furniture and supplies, hoping that I'd eventually get more time with my daughter. But most days, the nursery just served as a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I'd sit in the Mark had remarried rocking chair, sometimes holding stuffed animals and trying to remember what it felt like to hold my own child. Mark had remarried within a year. I found out through social media, seeing photos of him and his new wife at what looked like a small ceremony with close family and friends. She was a kindergarten teacher, blonde and wholesome looking, the kind of woman who probably never made inappropriate jokes or invited ex-boyfriends to important family events. In the wedding photos, Mark looked happier than I'd seen him look in years. My daughter was there too, wearing a little white dress and being held by her new stepmother, like she belonged in that family more than she'd ever belonged with me. The captions look in years talked about new beginnings and blended families, and the joy of finding love again after heartbreak. I wasn't mentioned in any of the posts. Of course, I was the ghost mother, the cautionary tale, the woman who'd thrown away her family for a joke that nobody found funny. The custody arrangement never improved. If anything, it got worse after Mark remarried. His new wife was apparently wonderful with my daughter, providing the kind of stable maternal presence that I'd never been able to offer during our brief time together. The court saw no reason to custody arrangement never improved, disrupt a living situation that was clearly working well for everyone except me. My visits with my daughter became more painful as she got older. She'd cry when the social worker brought her to me, reaching for the door like she wanted to go back to her real family. She called Mark's new wife, Mama, and had no special name for me at all. I was missing visits, just another adult in her life, less familiar than her daycare teachers. I started missing visits because they were too emotionally devastating. Seeing my own child treat me like a stranger, watching her prefer the company of a social worker to spending time with me, was more painful than the isolation of not seeing her at all. My lawyer warned me that missing visits would hurt my case if I ever wanted to petition for more time, but I couldn't bring myself to care about legal strategies anymore. I was trapped in a life that felt like punishment for one moment of poor judgment, and I didn't see any way out. I'm writing this now from my studio apartment, 3 years after that day in the hospital. My daughter is walking and talking, and has no memory of ever living with me. Mark and his wife, after 3 years, just had another baby, a son who will grow up as my daughter's full-time brother, while I remain a footnote in her story. I still think about that moment when Tyler walked into the hospital room. The look on Mark's face, the laughter that died in my throat when I realized nobody else found the situation amusing. I replay it obsessively, wondering what would have happened if I just let the moment pass, if I'd been satisfied with the attention Tyler had been giving me through text messages instead of needing to create drama in real life. People tell me I should forgive myself, that everyone makes mistakes, that I was hormonal and not thinking clearly after giving birth. But forgiveness feels I lost my identity impossible when the consequences are so permanent and far-reaching. I didn't just lose my marriage. I lost my identity as a mother, my place in my daughter's life, my future as part of a family. I wanted to feel something again after months of Mark's distance and emotional unavailability. I wanted to feel something again. I wanted to wake him up to force some kind of reaction to prove that I was still worth fighting for. Instead, I discovered that some jokes aren't funny to anyone but the person telling them. And some wounds can't be healed with explanations or apologies. The worst part is how normal Mark's life looks now on social media. Family photos from weekend trips, birthday parties, ordinary moments that look warm and happy. My daughter has the stable childhood I wanted to give her, just with someone else. providing the maternal love and consistency she needed. I've become the woman who destroyed her own family with one poorly timed joke, who lost everything because she needed attention more than she valued what she already had. The woman who sees her own child once a week in a supervised setting because she couldn't resist stirring up drama at the worst possible moment. It was just a joke. Just one little joke that seemed hilarious in my hormone-adult, emotionally starved brain. But now I understand that some humor comes at a cost that's too high to pay, and some mistakes follow you forever, regardless of whether you meant them or not. Even my baby has a new life without me. She calls another woman. The apartment is quiet now, Mama. Lives in another house, celebrates holidays and milestones with people who weren't there when she was born, but who've been there for every day since. I'm the biological mother who became irrelevant, the woman who gave birth but couldn't figure out how to be a parent. The apartment is quiet now, except for the sound of upstairs neighbors living their normal lives. I scroll through photos of my daughter that Mark's wife posts sometimes, watching her grow up from a distance like she's a celebrity child I follow on Instagram rather than my own flesh and blood. Tomorrow I'll go to work and pretend my life is fine. This weekend I might have a supervised visit if I can emotionally handle it. Next month, Mark and his wife will probably post more photos of their perfect family, while I remain the absence in every picture. The mistake that led to their happiness together. But tonight, I'm just sitting here in the dark, remembering the sound of my daughter's first cry and wondering how many more years I'll spend paying for those 5 minutes. When Tyler stood in that hospital room, and nobody laughed at my joke except me.